Did you, sir? Hi, everyone. Welcome to another session of online causal inference seminar. The format of today's seminar is slightly different. We will be having two seminar speakers, each plan to talk for half an hour. So we're excited to have our first speaker be Philipp Faller from Karlsruhe Institute for Technology, talking to us about self-compatibility, evaluating causal discovery without ground truths. And we're also excited to have our second speaker be Bijan Mazaheri from Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard, talking to us about synthetic potential outcomes and the hierarchy of causal identifiability. And today's Q&A will be handled by Dominic. I'll hand it to him.
Thank you, Razi. Well, as usually, please submit questions via Q&A. We will, if it's a clarifying question, we will directly ask the speakers. But if it's a larger question, we will take them at the end of the seminar. Okay. Without further ado, Philipp, please get started.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here. And I'm gonna talk about some work that I did with my brilliant collaborators from Amazon Research Tübingen. I'll tell you about the concept that we wanted to propose called self-compatibility. So I'll briefly go over the causal formalism that I'm using.
Sorry,
yeah.
Do you want to share slides or?
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Stop sharing if you didn't. Looks good.
Cool. Yeah, so I quickly go over the formalism. So I'll use the DAG-based formalism of causality, which basically means I assume there is some structural causal model that describes the dependency between variables such that for every variable there's a set of parents and a noise term, and we have a function that assigns the variable a value depending on those two things. And we assume for this talk that there aren't any cycles in these assignments. And what we eventually care about is the causal DAG or causal graph that qualitatively describes these dependencies by saying whenever a variable xj depends on xi, we have an edge in the graph. So for example, here we have a really simple structural causal model where y depends on x and z. And more precisely, we will talk about causal discovery algorithms. So algorithms that take, in our case, IID samples and output the causal graph. So today we don't consider cases where you have interventional data or anything. And the thing with causal discovery algorithms is that they're not the big thing you might think they could be. And for example, I brought you this quote concerning DAG literature in general from Guido Imbens that says, the DAG literature has not shown much evidence of the alleged benefits for empirical practice in settings that resonate with economists. And of course, there's not a single reason for this. So there's plenty of criticism you could have. For example, you could ask whether causality is even a meaningful or real thing to look at, or you could criticize that it actually is not well defined. Or you could question whether some of the assumptions don't make sense in application settings. And those are all interesting things to discuss. But today I'm going to look at a problem that's even more pragmatic, namely that we don't actually know how well causal discovery works because we have to make strong assumptions for the algorithm to work. And these assumptions usually are not testable or hard to test. There are very few real data benchmarks where we know the causal ground truth. So if you've ever worked with one of these algorithms, you might be familiar with this gene regulatory network or the Tübingen causal pairs dataset. But what people most of the time use is simulated synthetic data, which of course contains biases and preconceptions about what causality means. So the big question of my talk today is, can we somehow evaluate causal discovery without having access to a ground truth graph? And the main idea that I want to propose boils down to the following. You run the causal discovery algorithm on different subsets of the available variables. And then you'll get different graphs, and you check whether these graphs are compatible. So for example, if we apply an algorithm to these sets S and T here, and in one graph you would observe X causing Y, and in the other one Y causing X, without having defined what compatible means, I think it's intuitive that this is odd. Why is this something interesting to look at? Why don't we do something more standard, like for example, a cross-validation? Consider the following example. So assume we have this ground truth graph over here, and we want to recover it using the PC algorithm. If you're not familiar with the PC algorithm, the details don't matter. But the crucial thing is it depends on conditional independence tests, and it makes this faithfulness assumption, which basically states that you get exactly the independences that the graphical structure implies. So if we now assume that we get all the dependencies and independences from this graph, except for this unfaithfulness between Y and Z2, and then we apply the PC algorithm to the subsets S and T, then we get exactly the situation that I already showed you. And this is something that you could never detect with a cross-validation, because no matter how you massage your data, you'll always have that Y is independent of Z2. Now you might ask, hang on a minute, I can't find all the errors like this, right? And this is actually true, but we still think it's interesting to look at this falsification scheme, mainly because we see it in a line with Popper's philosophy of science, which says you can actually never really verify a theory, but if you have several attempts to falsify it and they fail, then the theory is corroborated. Okay, now let's go into a bit more detail in how we want to define self-compatibility. So first of all, I want to define something that we call latent projection, or that you might know as a marginal graph. And I'm going to define it in terms of acyclic directed mixed graphs. But in the paper, we also have a definition in terms of mags and pegs, if you're more familiar with that. So the idea is, if you have a graph G and a set of nodes S, then the latent projection of G onto S is the graph that contains all the nodes in S, all the edges between nodes in S, a direct edge if you have a hidden mediator path, and a bidirected edge if there's a hidden confounder. So if a node not in S is a hidden confounder. So for example, if you have this instrument variable setting over here, and we project that onto I, X, and Y, we would add the bidirected edge for the unobserved U, and leave all the other direct edges. And now the definition of what we actually mean with compatibility. We say if we have some graphs over different subsets of nodes, they are graphically compatible if there is some joint graph such that if you project this joint graph onto each subset, you'll get the respective graph that we were given. And throughout this talk, I will sometimes use this C notation to say that some given graphs are compatible. There are some subtleties with this definition in the sense that it contains a slight genericity assumption in the spirit of faithfulness, and I'm afraid I don't have time to go into details, but we also, first of all, the example, I'm sorry. Yeah, so this is basically what we already discussed. Here on the left-hand side, you have two graphs that could come from one joint graph, and these two cannot be the latent projections of a single graph. Okay, but what I just said is there is some subtlety to this, which is why we also wanted to define a second notion that only talks about interventional probabilities, because at the end of the day, this is what most people care about. And here again, we say some graphs are interventionally compatible if there is, again, a joint graph and a joint distribution such that the observed distribution is a marginal of this joint distribution. The distribution is Markovian to the joint graph, which basically means it is it could have been generated by this graph. And also we say it has for every interventional distribution. I don't know, maybe for potential outcome people, this is something like a distribution over potential outcomes. If this is identifiable in one of these small graphs, then we want it to be the same in this joint graph. And again, if you look at the previous example, here everything works out nicely, but in this graph, again, we have the correct interventional probability, but here, since now X is a child of Y and not a parent anymore, the interventional distribution would just be the marginal. And if Y is dependent on X, which we assumed, then those two are different distributions. So we have a contradiction. Okay, so the definitions that I just gave were talking about graphs. And now we want to take things to algorithms, because this is what we care about. So we say a causal discovery algorithm is self-compatible if we can apply it to different subsets and the resulting graphs are compatible. Okay, so far so good. Nice definition. And now I'm going to show you some properties of this definition that we think are interesting and justify why we defined it this way. So first of all, maybe the bottom line, if we have distributions that fulfill the assumptions of our algorithm, then in the limit of infinite data, we would never get incompatibilities. So the algorithm is always self-compatible, which is not very surprising. But on the other hand, what this says is if we find something incompatible, then we know that either our assumptions are violated or we have too few samples. And in this setting, we will say the assumptions are falsified, or sometimes more loosely, we just say the algorithm is falsified, which is not supposed to say that it's wrong. Okay. And the good news is we looked at two algorithms that people actually use. The FCI algorithm, which is very classic, I think, and the repetitive causal discovery algorithm, which is a variant of the popular Lingam algorithm that accommodates for hidden variables. And those two are actually falsifiable with our compatibility approach. And you've basically seen the proof sketch. It works very similarly to the motivational example. Now you could ask, okay, but isn't every algorithm falsifiable? And I leave this open, but or I don't show you an example, but I can say it's not a trivial property. So there are you can come up with algorithms that are actually not falsifiable. Okay, next question you could ask is, well, okay, we can only falsify the algorithm, but how strong is this criterion? How strict are these conditions? And to this end, I'll define this property that we called merging enabling, which says the following. Suppose we are given some distributions and an algorithm. Then we say the algorithm is merging enabling if there's only one joint distribution for these marginals, such that A is compatible on the joint distribution and on the subsets. And on the other hand, we want that there could, in principle, be a second joint distribution if we ignore self-compatibility. And what this is supposed to say is that the self-compatibility requirement restricts the space of joint distributions so strongly that there, in fact, is only one distribution that is not falsified. And again, the two algorithms we looked at, FCI and RCD, are merging enabling. The proof sketch, let's look at the time if we have time for this. Oh, I didn't. Yeah, but should be enough. Okay, so suppose we have these two marginals, S and T, and we apply some algorithm like RCD that actually can, in the bivariate case, tell us the direction. And we find X causing Y, Y causing Z. And also what RCD can tell us is that Y is causing Z in an unconfounded way. And then we want to reconstruct a joint distribution. Then we have X causing Y causing Z, obviously. But since Y is causing Z without confounder, we can't have this edge from X to Z, because then X would be a confounder. This means that X and Z are independent given Y. And since we already observed the two marginals, we can simply, from this information, stitch together the distribution uniquely. And without this constraint that we can't have this edge from X to Z, you can stitch them together in many ways. Okay, so far on the theory side. Now, what would we do in practice? The thing is, I just argued that self-compatibility is a strong property, and actually in our experiments we saw that you rarely get that on all subsets that you test, everything's compatible. So what we would propose to do is relax this binary decision to a score where we count how many incompatibilities did we witness. And we also propose one score per compatibility definition that I gave previously. And one more thing I'd like to add to this is, so we came up with the scores because we think they are reasonable and they worked reasonably well in our experiments. But if you have other downstream tasks, then surely you could come up with different scores. So there's no strong reason why these should be the only ones. So the first score is the graphical one, and we say, or the quantity we look at is the SHD, which is basically counting how many edges would you have to change between the graphs to get from one to the other. And we look at the SHD between the algorithm applied to all the variables that are available, and then project it to the subset that we are currently interested in. And then we also run the algorithm just on the subset. Okay, and then we compare the SHD and we average over all subsets that we are looking at. And the second score is a little bit more complicated, but it eventually boils down to looking at interventional probabilities between pairs X and Y. And then we use a parametric test proposed by Su and Henkel that checks whether two conditioning sets or more than two conditioning sets result in the same interventional distribution for linear models. And then we count how many times the test rejected, and we normalize. And how did that work in the experiments? So here we have synthetic data, so we actually know the ground truth and can compare with a quantity that we don't have access to in practice. So again, this is the SHD between the graph that we found on all variables and the actual ground truth graph that generated the data. And on the y-axis, we have our incompatibility score. And what we observe is that we have this correlation. So you could think of our score as a noisy version of SHD that you can compute without access to ground truth. Although I have to say we have no theoretical or we have no guarantee that it looks as nicely as in this plot because, as I said earlier, we only can falsify things. Yeah, and that was everything I wanted to show you. So to wrap up, we discussed how we could evaluate causal discovery algorithms without ground truth. The idea was to apply the algorithm to different subsets of variables and then check whether they are compatible. This way we can falsify the assumptions of an algorithm or that we have enough data. Actually, this seems to be a strong criterion, and in our experiments we saw a correlation with the SHD that we can't calculate in practice. Yeah, and we just hope that this gives inspiration for more research into how to actually test and falsify causal discovery methods. So thank you for your attention.
Thanks for the nice talk. This is an important problem to work on. We currently don't have questions in Q&A, so I just would encourage everyone, if you have questions, please submit them. We can also take some of them at the end of the seminar. Maybe one quick question, Philipp. So have you also tried it on PC and GES? Because they are also super popular in practice. How
yes.
Self-compatible are they?
I mean, they are not self-compatible. The thing is that maybe I should have mentioned this more clearly, but obviously if you take these subsets of variables, there's a high risk of introducing hidden confounders, and PC and GES assume to observe all variables. So we don't even expect them to be self-compatible. And in fact, we didn't observe this nice correlation between SHD and our score. We did try some things with only looking at subsets where from the joint graph we don't expect hidden confounders to exist, but yeah, it just didn't work in our experiments. I can't say whether it couldn't work in general.
Makes sense. Thanks. In practice, I would actually, so what you do is you're subsampling variables, right? And then checking the compatibility. What I would probably also do is you can like check, for example, maybe there's a particular way you pre-process the data in biology that you could check, like whether that changes like the compatibility. Essentially, you could also, yeah, even do some subsampling the rows of the data. So I think what you're suggesting, like evaluating the stability kind of is actually quite broad. And in practice, you should do it a lot among like a lot of dimensions at the same time. Oh, I see Razi also has a question or comment. Yeah.
Thanks, Philip, for the great talk. So you made a comment about having some procedures that are non-falsifiable. I was wondering if that relates to the genal paradox and this generalized equality restrictions in ATMGs, if at all.
Sorry, which paradox?
The genal paradox that says like there is a null effect, but the test cannot detect that because of the Verma constraints or the generalized equality restrictions.
I'm not sure if this would make it hard to falsify it, but I mean the example I would have, or that's also in the paper, is even more more basic. So it's basically an algorithm that never commits to anything. So it says there's confounders everywhere, and then you can't falsify it.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. There's also a quick question Q&A. I think we still have time for that. Okay, two actually. Maybe let's take one for now. I'm going to read it. Have you checked how sensitive the procedure is on small samples?
We didn't investigate sample size, but would be interesting to look at. I agree.
Okay, yeah. Maybe so. I think what we can do now is, in the interest of time, we can maybe move to the second speaker. And Philipp, you can also answer some of the Q&A question via chat if you want.
Yeah, and thanks for the great questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much for a very nice talk. All right. Yeah. Bijan, whenever you're ready.
Yep. Let me just share my screen.